This is a talk about the paper that was just mentioned, which was published in February, The Unequal Impact of Parenthood in Academia, which was a project that took us a long time to do because it had lots of different moving parts. So I want to start off by saying something that, for the most part, we're all familiar with, but there was a paper published 36 years ago now that coined a term, this term, the productivity puzzle. It was one of the first to do this sort of synthetic look at differences in productivity between men and women, a topic we're very familiar with. And it itself actually references 50 past studies showing that women publish less than men. And so this question of why is it that there's a gender difference in publishing has been around for a long time. It claims that there are stable patterns of this kind going back all the way to 1920. This paper used a matched pair design of early career researchers, but just a relatively small sample compared to this data set I'll show you in a moment. And it found essentially that women are cited equally paper for paper, but they write fewer papers. And so it's really a question of the production of the science as opposed to the recognition of science. Now, there's been a lot of work looking at gender differences in science since then. And this is a very rich field. And there have been some identifications of other differences, of course. Some of these things may not hold up because of the small sample size. So anyway, so a long history of this. In our data, what we find is exactly this kind of pattern. We looked at 3 specific fields: computer science, business, and history, mainly in North America and particularly in the US. And we find exactly this kind of large gender difference in publishing. We focused on early career researchers in these fields. And so the 0 mark here indicates the time at which the person started their first faculty job. And you can see that in history and computer science, a small gender difference in publishing has already emerged. This is the cumulative number of publications here, has already emerged when the researchers start their faculty positions, and that gap tends to just grow over time. And over the 40 years in which there's been a lot of interest specifically in answering this question of what causes this gender publishing gap, there are many explanations, all of which have found some evidence for or against, perhaps. And just to list some of them: institutional factors, like whether you work at a research intensive or a teaching intensive university, the relative proportion of teaching and service work, if women do more teaching and service work than men do, even shadow service work in which women are doing more sort of emotional support for students and others than men. Research specializations can be a factor. If you work in a field that publishes a lot, then your productivity may be higher. And if there's a gender difference in which field you choose to go into, then you can see a gender difference in terms of publishing rates overall. And then, of course, there are things like biases in peer review. There was a very nice study that suggested that women spend a lot more time polishing their writing than men do. Men spend less time. And so as a result, if you spend less time writing your papers, then you can write more of them. Differences in career lengths, and of course, parenthood, which is the topic of this talk today. Unfortunately, over this 40 years of work, although there have been many of these hypotheses put out there with various amounts of evidence suggesting for and against, there's no one real answer. And this is in part because it's really hard to pin this down because there is lots of different factors that influence productivity in academia. Here's just a sample of papers that were published or articles that were written in the past year. COVID, of course, has brought this issue to the attention of many more people as a result of for instance, some of the study results we've seen previously in this session and many others, that the pandemic has had a particularly harsh effect on women in science. And so our study design was an effort to combine 3 different kinds of information. We wanted to combine information on the timing of parenthood, so when people had their first child, in which case they would move from being non-parents to being parents, and then experience all the joys and miseries of being parents. For instance, if I'm a little bit tangled up in my talk today, it's because I was up for 3 hours last night with a sick baby. Okay, so timing of parenthood, and then productivity over time. So publication rates, but not just total, but like yearly publication rates. And then also we wanted to look at leave policies in particular, see what effect these had on people. So the survey, which we ran several years ago, we had a pretty good response rate overall. We about 3,000 tenure track faculty. We focused on US research intensive institutions. So these are PhD granting institutions in 3 fields: computer science, business, and history. It's about 450 institutions total. We then linked to each of these respondents to our survey their papers and books. So these are peer-reviewed items that people are evaluated based on for tenure and promotion and so on. And it's about 100,000 of those items. And then we also had data on the institutions themselves. So we had the prestige rankings, so we could evaluate whether or not there were differences as a function of how elite the university is that you're at. And then also we hand collected parental leave policies, which I'll tell you was really hard. Even just to find these things and translate them into a standardized set of rules or codes was very difficult. So we have parental leave policies for these institutions too. Okay, so the basic statistics from our survey show that academia really is a family business, that most of the faculty who are 40 years and older have kids, 71% of women and 82% of men. So you already begin to see a small gender difference there, which reflects some of the previous comments by some of the other speakers that people are making choices about whether to have kids based on their careers, their career choices. Almost 40% had their first child before they started their first faculty job. That was a real eye-opener to me. The average age at first child in our study was 33, which was the same for men and women. But that number is further away from the average in the US for women than it is for men, which also echoes something we heard earlier, that women are calculating the risks and the impacts of having kids on their career and are making different decisions than men are as a result of that. We found actually that parents are not more or less likely to occur at high or low prestige institutions, that parenthood is sort of independent of prestige, and that the average number of children is about 2, in fact. But again, we see a slight gender difference, which again echoes this idea that women are making strategic choices about whether and how many children to have as a function of their career concerns. Okay, so the central question we wanted to ask was, what is the impact of parenthood on productivity? And to do this, we use a causal inference setup. This allows us to better isolate the actual causal effect of the parenthood event. We use this technique called comparative interrupted time series from causal inference in general. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 pools of people. One pool is the parents and the other pool is the non-parents. And then we're going to assign a counterfactual birth event to the non-parents so that we can align the productivities between the non-parents and the parents to say, at the age of the first child, or the career stage of the first child, and then compare that person to somebody who would have had a child in our counterfactual scenario. And this allows us to pin down the exact size of the impact of parenthood. And then we're going to plot publications from 5 years before the childbirth and 10 years after, so we can see what the impact is after, and we can compare what the trends are before. Okay, so here's what it looks like for computer science, which gives us sort of the cleanest results. I'm showing you the publication patterns for before the childbirth event for both men and women separated. So the solid dot is people with children, and the open dot is people without children. And already you can see something that is slightly mysterious. And we had to scratch our heads a lot on this, which is that people who become parents are actually more productive than people who never become parents. Very slightly in this sort of pre-period of having children. But then once we have the child event, then we see a rather dramatic effect, which is essentially that women's publications rates experience a large and statistically significant negative shock. It varies in magnitude across fields, which has some interesting implications for exactly why it is that it's less, for instance, in computer science and greater, for instance, in history. Men's publication rate generally shows no evidence of a shock, either positive or negative. There's been some papers written suggesting that men on average use parental leave to write more papers. We find no evidence of that, and I'll maybe revisit that point a little bit later. The shock is greatest in history, and this we think may be due to the fact that there's less collaboration in history. In computer science, the shock is the smallest. That's my field. We have a very collaborative culture in which we have lots of graduate students. We have collaborations between researchers. We tend to write articles and not books. We don't write monographs as often. And so it may be that the impact of parenthood is moderated to some degree as a result of having essentially a support network in academia that allows us to pull back on our own publications a little bit to take care of the kids when needed, and rely on our collaborators to sort of carry the weight for us during this period. The shock is so great, though, that, for instance, in computer science, which also has the highest publication rate, that if you accumulate the difference in terms of the number of papers that the mothers would have written if they had not become mothers, it's about 18 papers over the course of 10 years, which corresponds to a 5-year productivity gap. It would take 5 years for the mothers to catch up to their to where they would have been if they had not had the child. It's a pretty big difference. In our survey, we asked a lot of questions about the use of parental leave policies. What we found essentially is that, unsurprisingly, half of women and maybe about a fifth of men said that these leave policies are actually somewhat or very important for them choosing a current faculty job. And so this implies that these leave policies are an underused recruitment and retention tool, that if universities would strengthen these policies, they could retain women and also recruit them, for instance. And so institutions that are interested in increasing their gender representation by recruiting women could use this specific tool in order to do better on that measure. When we look at the availability, however, we find that only about 2/3 of the institutions in the US even have a parental leave policy. The average length varies only a little bit between men and women, but most policies did not specify whether it covered teaching, service, and research, et cetera. In some cases, the policies were very draconian. They required people to negotiate with their supervisors for the leave, or they required them to have some sort of medical certification of disability in order to take them, et cetera. But one of the most striking things we found in reviewing these policies from these institutions was how Byzantine they are. They're difficult to understand even for people who are experts at reading these policies, as we became when we collected this data. And so many of the people in our survey said that they were not even aware of their policies, or they were aware of them but did not take advantage of them, perhaps because they were too confusing. So one other way that universities could improve this situation is just to simplify the policies and more clearly explain how to use them and what they give you. One thing we really wanted to look at, though, in the study was whether or not the publishing gap is shrinking or not. So we looked at, the results I showed you are for basically 40 years of time. We then looked at dividing our population into people who had children before the year 2000 and people who had children after the year 2000. And what we found is that the gap is narrowing. So not only did gender neutral parental leave policies in the US become significantly more available since 2001, eligible fathers are now about twice as likely to use parental leave, which as a father who used it 3 times, I'm really glad to hear that. But they still use that parental leave much less often than women do. Women use it in the US at a rate of about 90% when it's available to them. But the productivity gap itself seems to be narrowing. So here's what it looks like comparing the pre-2000 faculty to the post-2000 faculty for kids. We find that in computer science, the gap was 27 papers 10 years after the first child's birth, and it's narrowed to only 10 papers. So it suggests that this is not a fixed effect out there in society, that in the US, things are at least moving in a more positive direction towards a more equal basis. And in some cases, for instance, business, we see that the gap has basically gone away entirely. Whereas in history, we see this sort of weird thing where the gap only emerges something like 6 years or so after the child's birth. So the takeaway message from this is that things are dynamic in this case. And we can point to, for instance, the availability of gender neutral parental leave policies in the US as possibly a cause of this. If fathers take leave more often, that will also shift the burden away from the mothers who are also in academia, allowing them, for instance, to do more of the work that they would like to do. So to conclude, what we find basically is that parenthood is the vast majority explainer of the gender productivity gap today. It may not have been the case 50 years ago. Some of the other causes that were put forward may have been more at play then, but today it seems like parenthood is essentially the main cause of the gender productivity gap. Fathers don't systematically get a boost from parental leave, but parental leave is especially important to women for recruitment and retention. But it's really important for all parents because of work-life balance. 80% of parents have, 80% of academics are parents. And because fathers are increasingly taking leave, maybe this is an opportunity to really bring them into the conversation to push these institutions to do better for parents in general. There's still a lot of work to be done because only 2/3 of institutions in the US at least have any paid leave. And many times that paid leave is very difficult to use. There are a few caveats I want to mention about our study. One is that we didn't ask about dual careers or relationship status. So we don't know whether or not the women in our study had an academic partner or not, and vice versa for the men in our study. The sample is also current faculty only, which means that we may be selecting for those who experienced a smaller productivity gap, a sort of survivorship bias effect. And that's our hypothesis as to why it is that academics who then become parents later on in the US end up being more productive before having kids than those who did not choose to have kids. And then finally, I want to point out that productivity really is a very crude measure of scholarship contributions. and that we should be very careful about trying to say that this is the measure that we want to equalize on. We really want to focus on overall scholarship, but productivity does give us sort of a general sense of the impact. I want to close by thanking all of my collaborators, especially Dr. Allison Morgan, who was the lead author on this project. She just finished her PhD. Yay. This paper appeared in Science Advances in February and was funded from the National Science Foundation and the Air Force. So thank you very much.